we're going.
3, 2, 1.
Oh, we ready? Okay, welcome to Monday again.
Monday.
Kirk.
Happy Monday.
We have an additional guest today. Yeah, introduce yourself.
I'm Victor, and I teach philosophy, so I met Kirk that way, and we'll see what we have to say.
Yeah, so that'll be an interesting spin on the things we go over today. All right, Kirk, what do you got?
Well, we're always waxing philosophic around here, so,
Yeah.
we figure we'd bring in an expert. Well, deaths in the news. Try to say that quick 10 times. So Neil Simon, dead, 91.
Yeah.
John McCain, dead, 81,
Yeah.
something like that.
Died on the same day that Ted Kennedy died of the same thing. Just a fact.
Coincidence?
So he went off of treatment a couple days prior. I think it was just
Saturday.
knowing that his doctors probably said, this is it.
I wonder if he has any freezer burn on him. Because maybe they stuck him in a freezer so they could...
Who, McCain?
Yeah, because now they've got to name out, the governor gets to call in the next, senator to replace him. And I think there was like some sort of time limit on that before he could do that. But, hey, that's my tinfoil coming out again.
Yeah. No, so he's in there for quite some time, 6 terms, I think. John McCain.
And let's see, what's the other one? We had, Aretha. Aretha's gone. And it was weird how that one went. It was like, oh, she's on her deathbed. And then 2 days later, they're saying, oh, she's fine. She's up. She's moving around. She's all good. She's dead.
Did you see the Madonna tribute to herself?
Madonna did a tribute to
No,
Aretha?
so they had the Video Music Awards, I think, like the next day or the day after, and there was like a tribute to her, but it was just Madonna talking about herself for about 20 minutes straight.
Girl power, right?
Well,
Speaking of girl power, gal down in Dallas, I believe DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth area, she is now suiting up with the high school football team, and she is playing football with the boys. Her name is Maddie Martin.
is she, what's her position?
I did not catch that. She's not a kicker. I'll tell you that, because I've seen it where they've had the kickers, but she's out on the field throwing it around. I did not catch the position.
Did they say her stats or anything? Is she a big girl or?
She looked like she was a good size for a high school girl.
So she just got in. She can plow through all the boys.
Yeah,
She'll probably do well.
I hope she does.
Yeah, everyone's going to be afraid to touch her.
That could be. That could be one reason why. Or maybe she's just
Just give Maddie the ball.
give Maddie the ball. Yeah.
Look at that. She's just running right through him.
Give Maddie the ball. Look at nobody's touching her. They're all within 6 feet.
Oh, good luck to her. That's
Yeah,
great.
Good luck to her. Hopefully she plows through some boys.
Yeah.
Let's see what else we got. So Neil Simon, the Odd Couple guy, he had a lot of stuff. That guy actually had 4 plays on Broadway at once back in the 60s. I mean, that guy was a playwriting machine.
Yeah, he was.
Mm-hmm.
I love The Odd Couple myself. I mean, originally, what was it? Walter Matthau was in the original play, and then they did the movie after it with Jack Lemmon, and that is just a classic movie.
Right, but then they did the show. Was there a show on The Odd Couple?
I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, and then there was the one with the actual TV series, right?
Right.
Yeah, with Jack Klugman and Tony Randall.
Yeah, right. There you go.
Yeah, and that ran for many seasons.
It did.
That had a long life. I mean, they're still playing the
But Lemon and Matthau ended up doing movies together later, like Grumpy Old Men.
Yep. Yeah, that was quite a pair.
Yeah, they were funny. Yeah,
They could play off each other very well.
yeah, they're dead too.
This is the death episode,
Death zone.
by the way. And then we had, oh yeah, well there we go. Nice segue for the next one, which was a Chinese doctor. What was his name? He's an anesthesiologist. Call
Un.
Kim Sun. Call Kim Sun. He killed his wife using a yoga ball filled with carbon monoxide. So he's an anesthesiologist. He's having an affair on his wife. He wants to get a divorce. She says no. So he fills up a couple of yoga balls, throws them in the trunk. She's driving around. Yoga balls deflate. She gets carbon monoxide poisoning. Dead.
Gives me a good idea. Except with some helium.
Now that would be fun.
Stick it in the faculty meeting.
So you go out with a high-pitched voice.
Very
So
creative.
what did he do? Just poke a hole in them, and they were quietly releasing?
They were just quietly releasing like a silent but deadly sitting in the trunk.
All she had to do was open the window. But you would notice it.
No, you just kind of get a little drowsy. But the thing that kind of implicated him was the fact that his daughter was in the car with the wife, and he accidentally killed his daughter.
Oh, that's
It's bad planning.
well.
He was like, honey, you need to stay home and do your homework. No. And so the police started looking into that. So yeah, he's on trial. He's in China, whatever they call a trial over there is. And I imagine he's probably going to be one of those guys in the ditch with the guy with the AK at the back of his head thing, probably pretty soon. You know, that whole deal. So happy Monday. What else we got? On the lighter side, on the astrophysicist side, there's some guys out at Cornell University. I think that's where Mr. Hawkins, wasn't Hawkins from
Cambridge.
He
Cornell?
was Cambridge.
Oh, that was Cambridge. Okay. So Cornell.
Well, he's dead too.
Oh, yeah. Another dead guy.
Just throwing things
People
out
are
there.
dropping like flies. What's up with this? Yeah, lucky to be alive, I think. All right, so we got so these physicists think that they've spotted the ghosts of black holes from another universe. So this is like some heavy space stuff going on here. But they have these black holes or remnants of black holes that they're finding. They're starting to think that they're from the previous universe that existed before
Before the Big Bang.
Before the Big Bang.
Yeah, I would argue that certainly there was something prior to the Big Bang, if you believe in that theory. I also read something a couple weeks ago that there was no such thing as black holes, that they actually don't exist at all. And by the way, from last week, I also heard aspirin was really bad for you today.
Aspirin?
Well, just to add to the things that doctors don't really know about, meaning
Oh, the good for you, bad for you.
good for you, bad for you
Yeah.
stuff. We had a couple more examples.
Okay.
See, it was the what was it? Carbs.
Well, it started with carbs and then milk and eggs and coffee and the things that they kind of go back and forth about. It's good for you, good, bad for you. No, today aspirin is bad for you.
Black holes are bad for you too, I think.
Second,
Black holes are bad for you too. I
black
think.
holes are bad for you too. Yeah, I wouldn't want
Very
to get
bad.
caught up on those if they exist. Apparently, so you're saying that they're seeing remnants of black holes that once existed.
Correct. And then they fizzled out after a period of time.
That were potentially from a previous
Universe.
universe
Right.
prior to the Big Bang.
Prior to the Big Bang. So they find this, but what the interesting theory was that they mapped out on this, and this was on, what was it, space.com, I think it was. But anyway, so I'll back into it. So basically they were saying, okay, so we find these remnants, and what we believe happens is that when you have a black hole, black holes happen all the time. And what their theory is that the numbers of black holes in the previous universe, eventually there were so many of them that it was nothing but black holes sucking everything up. Then the universe kind of like, and then it blew up again. So, black holes self-perpetuating. Next thing you know, you got another universe.
But these particles that are emitting from the black holes, aren't they supposed to be massless?
Yes, and timeless.
Supposedly.
Gravitons and photons.
That is right.
So how do you get the mass that's required for the stuff that the Big Bang bangs?
Back up for a second. So black holes will suck up actual matter,
Right.
hypothetically, right?
If they exist.
If they exist. Right? Keep going backwards, right? Then it would, dissipate? Or that matter is just now, not that we're all science experts, but...
From what I understand, it's kind of like matter falls into the black hole, but there's too much matter falling in, and so the excess matter splashes off. Some of it gets sucked in, some of it splashes off, and this is where you get your photons and gravitons.
Yeah, I have some of those at my house.
So it's kind of like drinking a bunch of tea and then just being given a thimble to do your business in. You're going to get some spray.
If they exist at all.
The thimbles?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Giant thimbles floating through space. All right, that's enough space for today.
Well,
That's
I'm
enough
just
science.
curious. What is your thought? What is your thought? Let's say the Big Bang actually did occur, right? What is your thought process about? It's difficult for the brain to process the idea of a beginning and an end, right? Or infinity, if you will, right? So our minds are made to think that if the Big Bang did occur, that it occurred from an event or from something. And what are your thoughts about what was there prior to that occurring?
From what I understand, and again, I'm not a physicist, but
Sure.
it seems as though that there is just some infinitesimally small compressed bit of matter. So the question is, where does that occur? Or where does that come from? And it seems one theoretical option is Hawking radiation, right? And Hawking radiation, from what I gather, is from these putative black holes, should they happen to exist. These two particles, one positive, negative, escape, and usually annihilate each other, but every now and then one particle manages to escape. And so I would assume then that the material out of which the stuff that the Big Bang is banged comes from that. But then this begs the question even further: where do the particles that emerge from these black holes come from? And so it seems to be just a constant pushing the envelope back. Well, you get an explanation for the stuff from the Big Bang, but where does that stuff come from? Oh, Hawking radiation. Where does that come from?
Right.
From black holes. Where does that come from?
Right. You keep going backwards.
Right.
So I mean, because generally people think of one of two ways: either the God theory, if you will. I'm not going to get into all that, but it was created and so on and so forth.
Right.
And the other is the Big Bang
Right.
theory, if you will.
Right.
Not including the television show, but but even that would seemingly have to have started somewhere, and obviously in our lifetimes, or maybe never in humankind will we ever figure all this out. It's much too complex and.
Well, I mean, it seems that's why there's a difference between physics and metaphysics, right? I don't know if we know what we mean when we speak of metaphysics. Oftentimes we think of tarot cards, hand reading, and the stuff that you have at Barnes & Noble under that rubric, but physics tells us, it seems, how things happen, but not why they are.
Right.
And so it seems that there's still a more fundamental question is, okay, well, whatever the mechanisms and the processes by which the Big Bang erupts, whether it's a creative act or some sort of physical phenomenon, why is there something to be acted upon in the first place? And to me, it seems like that's an interesting question. Stephen Hawking, it seems, thinks that you don't need God ultimately, right, to account for that. But I don't know. There seems to be something missing from the equation nonetheless.
Or a few things.
Or a few things, yeah.
Or
Freedom, for example. Right? He thinks there's no such thing as freedom. And so
freedom of what?
free will. And so everything can ultimately be determined based on the interaction of particles. And so, I can understand what's going on in your body from a biochemical perspective. that in itself is going to be reducible to some sort of course, chemistry, but then you have different interactions with atoms, so on and so forth. Those atoms are determined by the forces of nature, four laws. And so ultimately, Hawking thinks if you had a computer massive enough, you would be able to impute or compute all the variables and determine exactly what you do at this very second. So freedom is just a kind of label that I attach because that's the calculating power is so vast, I can't do it. And so for shorthand, I just say freedom. But really, there is no freedom.
Yeah, I have read about his some of his thoughts around free will before. I'm not sure if I've taken a side or not because I'm not sure it's as binary as that, and certainly the things that he put out there are theoretical as well, to the best of his understanding.
Like black holes.
So
Hawkins was an avid atheist, wasn't he?
yeah,
I think so. I mean, what do you mean by theist, right? And so what is the God that you're rejecting if you're an atheist? And I think that's...
I think he was rejecting the existence of a power of that being at all, that it existed at all.
Right.
Going back to your point about what happened prior to the Big Bang, what happened in black holes, and so on and so forth, that there was I don't know if you want to call it a superpower being of sorts that existed ever.
And I think that's part of the problem, right? When we say he's an atheist, well, that's the rejection of God. But what do we mean by God? Do we mean the God of the scientific explanation, the God of the gaps? Do we mean some kind of force of nature? What do we mean by God? And it seems that he has this notion that the God he's rejecting is a God that plays a scientific role, right? So when you look at ancient cultures, and you have Aristotle, and he looks up to the heavens and he sees the moon moving, the sun moving, the stars moving. Well, what's the reason for that? Well, they're on celestial spheres, but you just can't see them because they're crystal. So why do these spheres move? Well, they desire. What do they desire? Well, like anyone desires a cold beer on a hot day, you move, so you're drawn towards it, and they desire the gods. What are the gods? Just these ultimate cosmic principles. And so if you understand gravity, as Newton comes along and describes it, you don't need this anymore. And so the question is this the God that different cultures, different religions, different peoples have in mind or not? So I think when Hawkins affirms that he's an atheist, I think he's going to say, I reject the God hypothesis, the scientific God, but is that the only God that qualifies for the title? I don't know.
My understanding, I could be, and I'm going to be corrected, I'm sure, by somebody, is that, so generally I think we could argue that without statistics in front of us, that the majority of atheists, even though there are an infinite number of variables of type of atheists, simply, the majority at least, reject the God theory, meaning that God didn't create all of this.
Right.
Either it did or science did, or I'm not religious. I'm not a religious person, so I don't believe that I'm going to die and see the pearly gates and so on and so forth. And that is the generalism of atheism. I think Stephen Hawking's version of it was much more scientific in nature, about not believing that a super divine power had created all of this, but that it came from science itself, which is hard to process. Because
what is science?
Because you keep going backwards and always want to ask yourself, well, it's the question of infinity, of sorts. Meaning, if there is such a thing as infinity, it's not something that a human brain can process. That things don't ever end. The sky never stops. People would theorize that the universe is expanding.
Sure.
Right.
And it's accelerating too.
It's an acceleration. That's faster and faster at every moment. But then you could go on to the other side of it and say, what is it expanding into? Right? Doesn't it need space to go, or is it being created on its path?
Right.
Answers we're not going to have today, obviously, but even discussing the concepts of infinity, And I think, from my understanding of his belief and my a little bit of reading about Stephen Hawking on that particular topic, is that not only that he was not going to die and go to heaven, but that it wasn't that the universe as we know it, and whatever other the composition of everything that we see was not created by a super being, if you will, or beings, or whatever you want to call
it's
it,
just
whatever
energy.
gods would be, right? Energy.
It remains constant.
And then what's energy, right?
Exactly. Where does
So
it come from?
we stop there, right? We'll get back to it in a bit. What else you got that's...
I ran out of topics there. I mean, I was like looking at the universe within the universe there for a second.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because I think about this often, and I think it's an interesting angle on the science part, and I think that we could probably get into the philosophy a little bit from here. When you look up at the sky tonight, let's say we've got clear skies, okay, and you and I have talked about this before. And please correct me where I'm wrong, for anyone who might know. When you're looking up at the sky, you're essentially looking into an infinite number of images at any given moment, right? But since we're here for such a short period of time, they don't change very often. I'll give you an example. If you're looking at a star that exists, let's say, just for the purpose of the audience, 1 million light years away. That star may, depending on its age and its
May be
brightness,
dead,
and so may very well be gone right now. Now, if you're looking at a star that is 20 million light years away, and depending on its age, it could very well be there or not be there now. Well, when you look at the night sky, you're actually looking at an infinite number of images, none of which are singular. Does that make sense? Meaning you're looking at, if you're looking at something that's 1 million light years away, then that light is getting to you at this time. If you're looking at something at 100 million light years away, it is getting to you at this time. So as you look up into the sky, you're looking at an infinite number of images that comprise themselves as a single image in the moment.
Sure.
But that image was never actually there as we're looking at it. It never existed that way. Are you following?
I do. Yeah. Now I get it. Yep.
All right. So, it never existed that way because the stars that you're seeing, many of which are aged or gone at this juncture, were not there when another star that you can see is there.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's actually not a reality what you're looking at.
But the light is.
The light part of it is because it's now achieving its goal of reaching your eyeball
Sure.
at that moment. But what you're actually looking at is not actually there.
Does that become a time and perception?
I mean, some of it's still there, but
Well,
it's not
yeah,
where it was.
All right.
Does that make
Yeah,
sense? Okay.
absolutely.
In fact, that moment is very unique.
Well, it's
Never going to be that
It's
same
so
moment.
unique that it's in the millisecond. But since since that timing is so lengthy and our lives are so short, it doesn't appear to have changed in your lifetime, my lifetime, for that matter, for generations,
Anyone's
if
lifetime,
if not for thousands of years.
Thus, you can have constellations.
Right, because the constellations appeared just as they did 1,000 years ago when they were studied by astronomers and astrophysicists then. Because 1,000 years compared to the millions that it took to get here has not changed in any measurable capacity.
But if we start traveling in that, and I think there's been a few movies done on that, right? So you start traveling in space, you get out there far enough, eventually that stuff starts to change, right?
Oh,
Well, you start moving fast enough.
Well, yeah,
you'd have to be hauling
Yeah.
ass.
Theoretical light speed.
You'd
Put it
have to
that
be
way.
hauling ass to see it change. Otherwise, it's going to still appear the same and to be there.
We're getting lots of theories on black holes and all that other stuff. Who's working on the light speed engine? We got to get some people
Elon
on
Musk.
that. He floated an electric car out in space. I don't know if that had quite
Step
had
one.
the pulse engine on it that it would be needed. But yeah, who's working on that? We got to find out who that guy is and bring him in. Talk to him.
Need to start folding space.
This room would probably fold in on his brain. Maybe it's a gal too.
So how do you process that in your mind? Or do you think about it that way?
I guess I don't process it because that's a relatively highly scientific approach. And
I'm a highly scientific guy.
well, yeah, but that's not.
I just look up in the sky and figured out the
that's-
math.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, but that's not one's lived perception, right? I mean, yeah, you can take a step back, but that's an abstraction, right? When you're sitting up there and you look at the moon, perhaps that catches your eye, and then you look at the surrounding stars. And I don't know. I mean, perhaps if one is a scientist and does this for a living, he's used to, or she's used to this kind of attitude. But I think most people simply gaze up and have a sense of wonder, right? And then that in itself generates questions. Well, what am I seeing here? What's going on? I think probably a lot of people are going to look up and say, especially if it's out in the country where there are no city lights, and just marvel at the beauty of it, if there exists such a thing as the beauty of it. But so I think the question you're asking, or at least the way in which you're processing it, is a kind of second step, right? I don't think that's the immediate reaction that most people would have to just the
So
experience.
thinking about it in that capacity,
Right. And the second order theoretical capacity.
right? Because but it would be the equivalent of equating the Earth to being flat,
Right.
which it's not. I mean,
But
so-
that is our experience, right? I mean, that's our ordinary experience.
correct.
And so I think there's
Right. Your everyday driving,
the sense of the
you're
life
gonna-
world.
right?
Right, sense of the life world in which I can put something on this table and it's going to remain, or I put something on the ground and it's going to remain. But we know quite clearly
Right.
the curvature of the Earth. But that's not the way in which we ordinarily relate to it. That's a kind of scientific account that again is secondary and theoretical.
Right. So most people would gaze at the stars and think, okay, this is an image that is beautiful and fascinating and all that kind of stuff. Well, let me bring up a conspiracy before we get into the philosophy of it.
Black holes.
A conspiracy that it doesn't exist at all.
Okay.
I know Kirk will enjoy that one.
I'm sorry. I was gazing in wonder at the sky, wondering how
when you
small
look
I am
when you look
in
at
the
when,
context.
when you look out tonight, realize what you're looking at is not an image. It's not a static. That might be the better way to say it. It's not a static image of any one moment. It's a unique view.
It's a dynamic reality.
Right, exactly.
Well, I can't help but ever feel really small when you start thinking about that. And I don't mean like, blazing up a doobie. Wow, I'm small, man. I mean, you're looking at it and you start wondering, why am I here? What is my relevance in the universe? Knowing that the universe is infinite, knowing that this universe may or may not be here. I may not be here for very long.
You won't be here for very
Oh,
long.
you won't be here
What am I
long.
doing here? Why am I here? I sit there and I watch the satellites go over and I go, dang, we put that satellite up there.
Oh, scientifically, I'll give you a quick answer. You're here because you're just a cell, or a series of cells,
I'm a big meat bag.
and that you're an animal, and everything that is here will be gone at some juncture. That's the simple answer. I don't think we're. This is my opinion, as human beings. That I'm not. I'm sure you may have a different view, given
Maybe.
your studies, and I respect that. But I'm not sure that we're here to do too much at all, other than pass through. And
But where are we going? Are we just going to the dirt nap?
No, I think we're just passing through. And when you look at the infants, the time continuum, if you will, if there is such a thing as that. Everything is theoretical today, so we have to put some parameters around it. But, obviously, we could say we're a speck or a piece of dust or dust in the wind or whatever you want to call it. Great song, by the way. I'm not sure we're here to do much at all.
So then why do we do science? Because we're going to die anyways.
Why do we do it?
Yeah.
I think we're an advanced being. I think we're curious.
But wouldn't it be better to be an advanced being, just a roach? A roach doesn't concern itself with science.
Say that again.
Wouldn't it be better
Roach
just
is
to be
mad.
a roach? I mean, you think about it. Yeah, we are advanced.
Well, advanced in certain capacities,
Sure,
and
yeah.
not so advanced in others.
But wouldn't it be better? I mean, doesn't that advancement cause a certain degree of anxiety? And-
no, it definitively does.
Yeah, and so from an evolutionary point of view, there's a lot of stuff that goes into making this, and energizing this brain of ours. Wouldn't it have been much easier, much more economical, just to?
It depends on who's determining that, though.
Well, there's no one determining it.
Well, I mean, if there is an entity determining that, let me give you an example. Sharks, for example, or elephants, or a lot of animals in the sea in particular, have defense mechanisms, much more advanced immune systems, much better communication methods, more advanced communication methods with whales, for example, or dolphins, or birds, certainly,
Right.
if you've ever seen them in major flocks.
Right. Big bird.
Right, yeah, thousands of them together in a symphony of organization, right? That are, so maybe I should back off a little bit and say that maybe we're not the most sophisticated, but we seem to have a higher level of conscience, maybe, which drives curiosity, which a cockroach can't do.
Right.
But that, hypothetically,
but
although they do, seem to live forever
and be happy.
and be, well, yeah, they're happy.
As
aren't they?
happy as a cockroach can be, right?
Yeah, I suppose they
Till
could.
the Orkin man shows up.
Yeah, or my shoe. But
Yeah, but you know what's funny about that is that we could come up with mechanisms for, for elimination, but not entirely. You cannot get rid of the cockroach. You're not going to get rid of the cockroach. It's not even a Band-Aid on a wound.
right.
You're just satisfying your consumer desire to not have them crawling over you in your home, right? Because they're seen as nasty and dirty and so on and so forth.
They're
But
prehistoric too.
Yeah.
for prehistoric. I mean, there's still dinosaurs here, for God's sakes.
Maybe their design is better than ours because they can survive longer.
That's why I was saying arguably we're not the most sophisticated. I do believe that we have a combination of conscience and communication that in some cases supersedes, which is why we're the king of the animal world, if you want to look at it that way. But aside of that, I'm not sure, and we'll discuss this in the next segment here. We'll get more into the philosophy and maybe the religious component of it. But Kirk, since we kind of, let me ask you,
Yes.
do you think that do you think that what you're looking at is real? That was the conspiracy theory question. Here's the issue. I'm not saying it isn't. I believe it is, but you can't touch it. You can't touch the moon. You can't even lift over 8 feet, right? So you're assuming that all of this actually is up there.
Yeah. I've seen lots of pictures.
Right. Who's to say it actually exists at all? Right.
Well, then we get into that matrix reality thing. But I think if you actually believe that, I think you actually have a psychological disorder that is really bad, and you probably need to be locked up for a little while.
So what are you saying?
Just saying. I mean, some days it feels unreal. I mean, when you're in a hard day and you're getting your butt kicked and, stuff isn't going right, you're like, man, and especially if things just aren't, they just aren't lining up. You just go, yeah, this is the bad place.
Well, it raises the question: what's real, right? I mean,
Well, we're told it's real.
sure, but
What was the movie with Jim Carrey where he was living in an alternate,
Something Almighty.
No. It was the
no.
game show or something, wasn't it?
yeah, something to that
I never
effect,
saw
where
that,
he actually
yeah.
lived in a television show, I think
So,
it was.
yeah, something like that.
Some kind of alternate reality, if you will. You know, all I'm suggesting is not one of us has touched a star, not one of us has gone to the moon, not one of us has done any of this stuff. It's all based on education, assumption, belief, hypothesis, theory,
Right.
hope that there's something greater.
And so the
Right.
question is, what justifies that belief? Is there evidence? Right. So I don't see, for example, the electron spinning around in this microphone, but yet, do I want to say it's real? I kind of want to say it's real, but I don't see it. What I see is a composition in a vague sense. But I guess the question is, what do we mean by real here?
Okay, so let's bring it back down to earth,
Okay.
literally, like you just did, and say, let's forget about the sky for a second. We believe this microphone to be in front of us right now. It makes it a little bit more believable because I can touch it and I can feel it, right? But that's just another series of senses, if you will, that are adding to that reality. It's difficult when you can't. People tell you the stars are there and this is where they are, and these high performance scientists are saying this is actually existence, and I believe it's probably true, right? But it's a belief. Hear my words.
Right.
Believe. I believe that to be true.
But then the question is
It
that,
also could be a lot of propaganda.
yeah. But is that belief justified? So, for example, I believe that it is probably 7 something, right? I don't know what time exactly. I don't have
Right.
a watch on me, but what would justify that? Well, I could look at my watch or cell phone and see what time it says. Is that evidence? If it says 7 whatever, what if the clock died? And it just happened to die at 7:15, and let's say it is 7:15. Is that justified belief? So I believe that there's a microphone in front of me on the basis of what? What evidence? Well, my sense experience, right? I believe that there are stars and moons and all these astronomical realities on the basis of what? Well, in a certain degree, you would say sense evidence, right? I mean, I see them.
That's one sense.
In one sense, I've been told about them. Is that evidence? Well, I would have to evaluate the competence of the person giving the testimony. I would have to evaluate the likelihood that this person is not trying to deceive me. I think that's where it becomes a bit more complicated in terms of verifying things that I have no direct access to. But I think we have to live in a way in which we say, look, I've never been to China, but I believe China exists. Why? I know Chinese people. Everything's made in China. So either the entire world is conspiring against me, that China, to make me believe China exists when it doesn't, but it's more likely and probable, and economical that it does.
So the conclusion being, and I think we all feel the same way in this room, that the universe and the stars and all that, they do exist. I'm simply pointing out that the empirical evidence is more difficult to digest,
absolutely.
given that you can't touch. You can't use your other senses in order to verify. And I'll give you an example. If you go into any particular judge or jury, right, and you present the exact same case, right, 50-50, you're going to come out with different outcomes each time, even if we bring experts to the room. And one expert is going to say this, and one expert's going to say something else. So then it comes down to, what do you believe? I mean, you see what you see. That's one of your senses. Then what do you believe in? Do you believe it is there? Okay. Most people do. Right. I'd say 90% plus of people believe that the stars exist and that the universe exists and so on and so forth. And I guess we just go with that. Whether it's expanding, as they say, particularly at an accelerated rate, which is new information, right, within the last year and a half.
It's been known for a while, I think, but still relatively new.
The pace of the pace of the acceleration of the universe is greater than
what you would expect.
They once thought it. Science is in its infancy, and it's fascinating, to see and hear about the new things that they find out all the time, all the way down to, is Pluto a planet or not?
Right. It is.
Is it now a planet again?
Well, that's what I was taught when I was 9, so it is. It was
Right,
on my
no,
poster on the bedroom wall.
Right. There's a solar system,
That's right.
and therefore it is. We'll take a quick break, and I'd like to hear more about what you do.
Sure.
Sounds good. Okay.
Okay.
There we are.
So I just wanted to start with the end of the last segment, and that is, Kirk, do you believe, because I like to talk about conspiracy theories at times, that the sky exists, not the clouds, the moon.
The sky does exist, yes.
All right. I forgot, we already asked this one. Did we go to the moon or not? Yeah, I think
We
we all said.
talked
Oh,
about
we
this.
definitely went to the moon.
I think we
There-
all said
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
I think there's some old astronauts that would insert their foot in your ass if they maybe said otherwise.
Aren't they dead too?
Well, I think there's a couple
there's
still
couple-
kicking
okay, a
around.
couple, yeah.
A couple old angry 91-year-old guys. What do you mean I didn't go to the moon?
I swear to God. Well, I'm not going to get into it. The fact that the flag was blowing and there's no wind up there. But anyway, we'll continue. So what's your background?
I teach philosophy at a local Catholic institution in Detroit. So been in higher education for the past 15 years or so.
How do those two things coexist?
What's that?
Philosophy and Christianity.
Some difficulty at times.
Yeah, I would imagine so. So what are some of the things that you run into when you're, trying to teach philosophy, and which tends to border science at times?
Well, it is the birthplace of science. Right?
I was being gentle.
I know. Yeah, you look at the old pre-Socratic philosophers; they were known as the physicists, right? So, the history of science, it seems, has been the gradual history of the emancipation of science from philosophy.
Is this a program that they felt, we're not going to name the school, but that they felt to be a good balance, or
More than the balance, they see it as absolutely crucial as a kind of propedeutic for any future studies in Catholicism.
I'm sorry, what was that word?
Propedeutic, a kind of preparation.
Okay, thanks.
It's kind of like if you're going to go to China, which may or may not exist, you have to hopefully have some kind of facility with the language, or at least know how to say taxi, right? So philosophy, I think, is regarded in that fashion.
So give me an example of some of the curricula.
It's a lot of the history of philosophy, so from ancient all the way up to contemporary philosophy, so spanning over 2000 years.
Postmodernism.
Well, of course, yeah.
Oh.
As well as more thematic or topical areas like ethics or philosophy of nature or epistemology, metaphysics, so on and so forth.
So when you're teaching ethics, for example, does that relate directly to, say, for example, the commandments, or are you permitted a little bit of
No, I'm
free? I hate to see free will,
or freedom, academic
freedom of
yeah.
speech.
No, I think that's the question, right? Are the 10 Commandments, as you alluded to, are they moral because God has commanded them, or are they moral and therefore God commands them? So could God have commanded, I'm in a bad mood today, I didn't get much sleep, so don't obey your mother and father? Could that have been the case? And so, in a certain sense, we already assume that there exists such a thing as morality. So if you're
Inherently.
well,
Or
we live as if there's morality, right? In certain senses. And so the question then is, okay, if this is presupposed, then what makes something good? What makes something bad? Is it simply the case that God commands something? Well, okay, maybe. That's an answer. But then how do you get around the sense that God is just arbitrary? I mean, maybe you're comfortable with the idea of an arbitrary God. I'm not particularly comfortable with that. Or is it the case that something is moral because you can determine it based on human nature? Or further still, something is moral because pure reason itself dictates it. So in an ethics class, we look at a variety of different perspectives.
do you think that that morality and ethics are built into humans by nature? And I mean that in the most literal capacity.
That there is.
Nature, meaning that that killing another human being under the guidance of, let's call it evil, without going into the
Religious aspects.
is not a good thing.
I think you can discern that, but I don't think it's something that everyone automatically intuits, right? And there's going to be a gray area. So if someone breaks into my house with a gun intending to do harm to my family and I shoot that person, is that murder? Is that killing someone? Some extreme people, I'm sure, would say, yes, absolutely. You can't do that. You should be willing to lay down your life rather than take a life. So, I mean, there's complexities within complexities, right? What do I mean by murder? What do I mean by killing? What do I mean by built in? I happen, just to rest assured, I happen to think murder is wrong. But not all people, I think, are necessarily going to be aware of that.
Due to mental illness, or due to
Potentially, yes.
society,
Society.
or due to social cultures?
Right. I
or-
mean, I think there happens to be such a thing as nature, but I also happen to think that nature is not so static as we were referring to earlier. I think it's a dynamic thing that presents its own intelligibility with and through experience. And so the question is, does that experience present itself to a person, and then does that person have the insight to be able to perceive the intelligible patterns they're in? And so I think, look, in abusive environments, people are, where there's poverty, for example, people are going to be exposed to murder, right? Or to violence, let's put it that way. The way to get ahead is to be violent. And in extreme cases, that's going to be in murder. And so this is a good. And so the idea that murder is wrong is going to seem completely incomprehensible to that person.
You know, it'd be interesting. Our first 2 episodes that we had here were actually criminals. One was named
Kirk?
Stabber Dave, and the other one was named Kirk Jenkins. I'm sorry. not
No,
Kirk
no,
Jenkins.
no. Rico.
Rico Suave.
Rico.
What was his name?
Hernandez.
Rico Hernandez. Who had committed Stabber Dave. Let's talk about him in particular. In the heat of the moment, and alcohol and drugs, had basically stabs a guy, and arguably his upbringing wasn't that of, I don't know. Again, we could go on and on about. Let's call it normal.
Sure.
Okay. But do you think that people are? I do believe this, and I'll give you an example why after. That people are, in fact, highly products of their environments. Not just, domestically here in the U.S., but say, for example, my children went to Christian schools their entire upbringing. So they believed all of that. All right, let's say biblical, right? And I would counter that on the weekends, by the way, with plenty of science and philosophy, because I wanted them to be what I believe to be thinkers, right? So I used to tell them, imagine that you had grown up in, and this is just an example, if you had grown up in Israel as a Messianic Jew, then that's what you would believe. And they said, absolutely not. I said, absolutely yes.
Yeah.
I said, absolutely not. I said, absolutely yes. Because you're going to be a product of your environment. That's what you would have been taught all your life. That's what you're going to believe is true. No different with Buddhism, any other religion. Not even just religions, but
Cultures.
just cultures in general. So how do you deal with that in your own mind when you're talking about ethics and morality, given that different cultures have different mechanisms and means of looking at them?
Right. I guess my own outlook is fundamentally Aristotelian. And Aristotle has his work, Nicomachean Ethics, which treats precisely of this issue. And he is an observer of human behavior and action, and he says it seems as though all actions aim at some kind of end, right? So you set your alarm clock at night before you go to bed because you want it to go off, the next morning. So there's an intelligibility to our actions, and that intelligibility is governed by the end to which those actions are directed. And so his question then is, well, when you look at human life, it seems as though there are a variety of actions, activities, choices, what have you, that constitute that. So is there an end to human life? That is to say, is there a goal? And he says, yes, it seems as though there's a goal. All can agree on this, that it's happiness. And I know, okay, that's a big issue, right? And he himself is aware of this, right? So I'm convinced that the Greeks were a lot smarter than most of us now. They just didn't have the technology. And he realizes, okay, happiness, it seems some people think that it's just pleasure, by which he means physical pleasure. Others think that it's a life of honor or virtue. And finally, others think that it's a life of contemplation. So here's the thing. If my actions are directed towards some end, and that end has a kind of normative value, any action that leads me away from that end is going to be considered, for lack of a better term, immoral. Any action that's conducive to that end would be considered good. Now, the big question is, what is that end? Happiness. That's not good enough, because what makes you happy makes you happy. What makes me happy makes me happy. And so Aristotle's is...
And it's a bit ambiguous.
Well,
In-
yeah, absolutely.
A
It's-
broad spectrum.
It's extraordinarily ambiguous, and
It-
Aristotle knows that,
right.
right? Because he's convinced that there is a kind of normative ethics. If happiness is just determined on our social structures, our cultural mores, that's what ethics means, right? When you look at the term ethike, that comes from the Greek term for custom, practice. The same thing with morality, right? Mos, mores, it's a Latin term for custom. So Aristotle wants to go beyond just that, and he wants to say there is some kind of objective ground. There is such a thing as happiness. And even if that happiness doesn't make you happy, it still has an objective normative basis. How does he get there then? Well, he's going to have to argue that there is such a thing as human nature. And so this human nature has its own intelligibility, and consequently then it's going to have its own proper end. Now, cut to the chase, he thinks that happiness is a life of contemplation. That is to say, basically, the philosophical life. I mean, he's going to say that, of course, he's a philosopher, right?
Sure.
What then about the life of pleasure? Well, he says this is a life of, literally he says, grazing animals. The cow, right, is a grazing animal. What does it live for? Pleasure, right? It eats whatever a cow eats, I don't know. It drinks during cow mating season, whenever that happens to be. It gets it on, right? And so that's what a cow lives for. And yet a cow is not a moral agent, nor is the cockroach, as we mentioned earlier, because the cow doesn't have reason, whereas humans do. And so Aristotle thinks it's got to be a rational end. Okay, so how does all of this fit together? We're not just purely rational, because we also have desires, right? We also have emotions. And that's where things get tricky, because our desires stem from our human nature, right? It's because I'm a human that I desire the things that humans do, right? Of course, I desire animalistic things because I'm also an animal, but...
Well, give me an example between an animalistic behavior. Say, for example, the most obvious, procreating.
Right.
Right, which is an animalistic and
Right, we all
primitive
desire
behavior. In order, I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about
Continuing the species.
Continuing the species, right? That's built in, right?
Right.
So give me a different example.
Of what? Animalistic desire?
Right.
Food, right? I wake up in the morning, I'm hungry, I desire something to eat. Water, I work outside, I desire something to drink. So there are animalistic desires that go along with my animal nature.
Is that an animalistic desire or a factor of, I don't want to say need, but
It is a need.
Survival.
Yeah, that's
Well, I mean, because you inherently know that you need water and food
Sure.
in order to survive.
and that's what an animal is going to pursue,
Right.
right? And it's going to pursue that in a fashion different than a plant, right? You're not going to see plants mating, at least not in the vigorous sense that animals do.
Right.
And so there's all of that, and the question then is, what do I desire? Okay, because that desire comes from the animal dimension, and that's where the rub is, because depending upon what your circumstances are, what your culture is, what your upbringing is, that's going to influence your desires. And those desires then can either lead you towards your end or impede you.
But let me go back to your plant example. Let's say a tree, for example, a pine tree.
Mm-hmm.
It does have its formula,
Sure.
if you will, and its mechanism of procreating,
Yep.
if you will, is to drop seed.
Acorns, or no, pine cones, yeah.
Right. Pine cones, and therefore it spreads, right? So that is something that is built into the trees. I don't
Nature.
want to say DNA, but
Well, Aristotle would say nature.
right, into nature. And there's this differentiator between animalistic and natural behaviors and leading in towards happiness or desires, which is a far-fetched ambiguity, particularly nowadays, to achieve happiness. Right, and what makes people happy? Most people think it's money, success, fame, power,
prestige.
But that I think that's maybe not the prestige and power piece of it, but the latter, the former, which I mentioned, are more society-driven things over, of course, the last 20 years in particular. Going back to power and prestige, certainly long there before, if not always. Do you think that that played a role, BC, as well?
Absolutely. I mean, Aristotle has this claim, thought alone moves nothing. That is to say, why is it that we act? I mean, so he's going to emphasize that we're rational animals, right? And I think most of us can identify rather easily that there is a difference between us and any other kind of animal. And shorthand, that difference seems to be rationality. And so we can think, we can reason, we can do mathematics or quantum physics or whatever the case. But thought alone moves nothing, which is to say, it has to be thought plus some kind of desire, right? Why am I going to begin to act? Because I desire something, whether that's the basic kind of survival level of just reaching my hand out to grab some kind of food and put it in my mouth, or reaching my hand out to grab a cup of water and drink it, right? That whole action right there has to be motivated by some kind of desire. So then the question is, what's cultivating that desire? What's determining that desire? And that's where Aristotle is going to say culture, society. And so upbringing, as he puts it, is absolutely crucial. It determines everything. And he's of the opinion, he asks the question, who should rightly be the student of ethics? He says, well, I can tell you who shouldn't be. Young people, children, teenagers. Why? Because their emotions do what? Rule them. Right? I remember asking my kids once, if our house catches on fire, what are you going to save? One said, I'm going to get my sister. Another, I'm going to save my stuffed animal. Another, I'm going to save my Thomas the Tank Engine. And they kept listing. What about me? Right? If there's room, right? So you don't trust children because they don't have the full experience to be able to discern within their emotions and desires. But he also says this, not only children, but also wicked people. That is to say, the vicious person. Because that person's desires, ambitions, emotions have been thoroughly warped. And so consequently, that person is always going to want what's evil. Now, he doesn't use the term evil. What he says is this, I always desire the good. Anything that you desire because it at least seems to you to be good, right? So if you're hungry, you desire food. If you're thirsty, water. Maybe you desire, a 10-pack of beer. Some might say that could be excessive. I'm willing to entertain that as a debatable point. But if you drink that entire bottle of Everclear out there, probably something bad's going to happen to you. But there could be a person who desires that. And so what Aristotle's going to say is the vicious person is the person who desires the inauthentic good. And so what cultivates that person's desires? Experience, right?
Okay, let me counter you for a second and say that just for the sake of the alternative point of view, not to suggest I'm right or anything, but wouldn't there be an argument to say it's the other way around? Meaning, so you asked your children, and I'll save Thomas the Tank,
right,
and I'll save my stuff, but they're doing it. Wouldn't they potentially be answering that under the guidance of what them living in their bubble and not understanding what criticalities could occur in life? So at the end of the day, it's potential, and this is just a hypothetical. That's in fact not what they'd save. If a fire was occurring, they'd go for Dad first. If he was incapacitated, so on and so forth. And then isn't there an argument to say that adults are tainted?
Yeah.
With too much experience and too much wisdom. I don't want to say wisdom.
Yeah, I would
too much.
Being jaded, perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps, in order to not think authentically anymore.
Yeah, but at the same time, imagine this. Let's say you get...
Not to say Aristotle's wrong.
No.
I'm simply suggesting
I'm put it this way.
They
I'm
have a
not-
more purist
no.
view of the world.
Yeah, I'm not an Aristotelian. I think Aristotle's on the right track, but I'm not an Aristotelian in the final analysis. But imagine this: you get onto a plane, and cross the country on this plane. You look at your pilot, 18-year-old kid. How would you feel about that? I mean, I know, speaking for myself, I would feel nervous, right? I mean,
Sure.
what do I want? I want a Sully Sullenberger, maybe not some 95-year-old geriatric who.
Right. You want somebody with experience that looks the.
And why? Why is that experience important? I mean, because here's the thing: experience presents us with intelligibility. What do I mean by this? If I say, for example, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, you can give me the next number.
14.
Exactly. Right. But if I just say 2, what comes next?
3.
Maybe I'm counting by tens, right? 10, 2, 12,
Right.
whatever.
But over divisible.
And
right.
so the greater the, I guess Aristotle and myself are committed to the idea that there is intelligibility within experience. And the understanding can discern the patterns of intelligibility, but only through the medium of experience. And so this is why we want a physician who has practiced for years, right, on a diversity of different kinds of patients before he or she comes to operate upon us, which is why we want a pilot who has flown several missions in Baghdad, for example, right? Because there is that presentation of experience wherein the intellect can discern patterns of intelligibility.
Well, it certainly would become applicable in the exercise of a trade,
Right?
for example,
Yeah.
flying an airplane, fixing my car.
Just reasoning mathematically.
True, because they can process the information.
Sure.
But you get to a point, I think, in your life, not everybody, where you've learned too much, and that the brightest minds are those that are still open and learning, and that is inherently how we advance.
Mm-hmm.
Not through, and I mean this respectfully, the 70 and 80-year-olds who are stuck in their ways,
Yeah.
but rather through the youth who are seeing what we've left behind,
Right.
if you will, and categorically monopolizing on those achievements
Right.
and making them better. I mean, clearly we're in an era right now, regardless of whether it's for the better or worse, of, say, social media, for example, that was not necessarily the brainchild of Mark Zuckerberg,
Mm-hmm.
but arguably those who preceded him,
Mm-hmm.
that created the platforms and the code and the mechanisms and the means and the mathematics in order to do that in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he capitalizes on something that occurred from a construct many, if not decades earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So, not to be against your software or stuff. I'm simply pointing out an alternative point of view.
Yeah, but I don't know that learning too much is itself a function of knowledge. It seems to me that's more a kind of attitude, right? And we all see the know-it-alls. And they're
Or the
just-
stuck in your ways, the cliches.
Exactly.
Right.
Just it's got to be this way. And I think that is problematic because you stop the process of raising questions and thus attaining new insights, right? And so I think there's a sense in which, for someone like Aristotle, that there is a nature that has an intelligibility, but that intelligibility is disclosed precisely through the dynamism of nature. And so if you render it static by either being a know-it-all or it's got to be this way, then you're closing yourself off to the potential of further insight. And so, I mean, I don't know that one can know too much. Yeah, you can be jaded, right? And experience has a way of doing that.
And that's a point where we should have tests for people and say, if you're no longer willing to make contribution to the planet in some capacity or humankind, it's time to get out the electric chair and get rid of you.
I think Kirk would agree.
All for it.
That's right.
But,
Oh, I mean, you have to make contribution. Kirk, what are your thoughts on all this?
well, I've just kind of been sitting here listening quietly, but I think a big takeaway from that is the youth. That key point is that youth are not trustworthy in carrying on and making rational decisions. And I think we're seeing that nowadays where people are propping up the youth, saying, they can tell us what our rights can and can't be, you aren't even out of high school yet. You don't have a clue. You're
Right.
still an emotional wreck. You know, my emotions didn't chill out until I was halfway through my 30s, right? And even then, they get a hold of me every once in a while. So I know I'm not perfect, but I am not going to have the youth telling me what our forefathers had already laid out with many years of experience behind them with tyranny, and have the youth saying, well, you can do this or you can't do that. Your rights come from the government. That's where I'm at.
I think we have to sort of differentiate here, because obviously I'm not suggesting that youth should be driving the Constitution. They wouldn't have the wisdom, the know-how, the wherewithal that those gentlemen did at the time in order to put together the constructs of what we have today, which would just arguably be the most sophisticated democracy in all mankind, right? So fair enough.
It's ours to lose, right?
Certainly. It's just a matter of saying that, look, I'll put it in layman's terms, that younger people are not as closed-minded as older people.
They can be.
It's just a suggestion.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not. They're
both-
still willing to. They're still consuming a lot of information and making their determinations about everything.
Sure, and
from
through no fault of their own.
what's right and what's
Right.
wrong. Well, no.
Because
it's just
I mean,
a matter of
they're kids.
matter of being
Yeah.
youthful. That's
And-
part
and
of being
there's,
youthful.
there's something comical, for me at least. I have 4 kids. The oldest is 14. There's something comical when I see the 14-year-old or even the 12-year-old refer to his or her own maturity or experience, or say, when I was a kid,
Yeah.
when they're giving lessons to the younger siblings, when I was a kid, what are you talking? You still are a kid. No. And again, through no fault of their own, because this is the summit of their experience, and they have nothing beyond that. But we have to recognize that there is a limitation there, right? If you're a 14-year-old, a 12, 18-year-old, 30-year-old, your experience is always going to be the limiting factor, right? And so if you only come up to a certain point within that experience, are you going to be in a position to discern the intelligible patterns therein?
Well, I'll give you an example that will support your position. .com era, where we had a lot of teenagers and youth gaining incomparable amount of capital through venturists, right? And employing that money in ill capacities to run companies that were not built on proper business structures and so on and so forth. I don't know if you remember this, Kirk.
Yeah.
But within about a year and a half after 2000, 2001, all of a sudden you saw these, let's call them the gray hairs came in and started putting some structure around these, because they're just blowing money on pool tables and all this kind of stuff, and there's no fundamental business philosophies,
Right.
no pun intended, behind what they were doing. Right, so arguably that's also true, and because their maturity, particularly in the U.S. Or Western countries, because we raise our kids forever now, right? As opposed to Eastern, where they let them go a bit earlier and
Right.
teach them more fundamental principles much earlier in their livelihoods. But getting back to the original question, you don't seem to struggle with, or the school doesn't struggle with the combination of having philosophy, and actually you said it was an encouragement.
It's mandatory. More than just encouragement.
It's mandatory
Yeah.
to go through it.
Yeah.
What else is mandatory, for example, as a balance to philosophy?
Well, I mean, in the liberal arts curriculum, it's going to be, of course,
Latin studies.
yeah, they do Latin, right? Latin, language studies, history. I mean, just your basic. If you go to any kind of undergraduate college and major in philosophy, that's the kind of thing you're going to be studying there. But just liberal arts in general, science, math, even theology.
Yeah. So how many? So theology and philosophy together is another interesting combination, wouldn't it be? Because one is very sort of definitive, and the other one is not.
Well, it depends on what you mean by the one and the other. right?
Theology being much more concrete in its standardization, whereas philosophy is an open argument. Not to suggest that there weren't historical referencing to either ancient or modern philosophers, but that it is, argumentatively, the epitome of free will thinking is philosophy, right?
But when you look at philosophy, philosophy is never conducted acontextually, but always within some sort of overarching discussion. And so, as we all know, the chief ancient philosophers, right? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so when you look at Plato, his concerns are in many ways going to be...
Just to be clear, I used to eat Play-Doh as a child.
Yeah, well,
it was a different kind of Play-Doh you're talking about.
Slightly different.
You're talking
kind of
about P-L-A-T-O. Okay.
That's right.
All
Yeah.
let's go.
And so Plato
Tastes good.
is trying. I'm sure it does. It's very salty, right?
Smells great.
It does. Is trying to respond to questions, problems raised by Socrates. So for Socrates, Socrates himself was operating in a tradition, of the naturalist philosophers, and he finds that, what does it matter what the ultimate principle or stuff that things are made of? I Socrates, want to know, what is the good life? So he's raising the question of morality. Plato takes this up, and his Republic in particular, right? What is the nature of justice? But he recognizes, in order to give an account of that, of the good life, I have to locate it within a framework, a metaphysical framework, the structure of reality. And he gives us this idea of these subsistent forms and so on and so forth. Aristotle, likewise, is a student of Plato, raises the same questions as Plato, but thinks Plato's completely backwards, and tries to find intelligibility not in some kind of transcendent realm, but here, right, in nature. So when you look at philosophy, there's a living tradition where questions build upon questions. And yes, it's absolutely freeing, right? Because whatever you see as an option for a kind of intellectual avenue, you can take that. But in a certain sense, there's also kind of responsibility to say, okay, if I go down this path, where is it going to lead me? Okay, so you look at someone like René Descartes, who was a 17th century early modern philosopher. And somewhat kind of like the questions you were raising earlier, like how is it real, right? The things that I see about me, are they real? And Descartes wants to depart from the kind of Aristotelian-inspired medieval and Baroque scholastic ways of thinking, and says, well, I'm going to call it into question. I'm going to call into question that anything that I sense and perceive is real. I'm going to call into question everything that I have believed is real. I'm going to call into question everything that I can possibly doubt. And finally, at last, arrive at something that is so indubitable that can become my foundation. If there exists no such indubitable foundation, then I'm lost in skepticism. And so that's where you get the Cartesian cogito, I think.
On the basis of what? Meaning senses? Meaning
No.
So it would be next to impossible to continue going down that path.
So start with sensation.
And to come to conclusions.
Yeah. Right. I mean, this is the radical novel character of Descartes, right? How do I know you're here or anyone else? Because I see you. What if that's just a hallucination?
Correct.
How do I know I'm not in a dream? Okay, well, even if I am dreaming, I know that 1 and 1 add up to 2, right? Wait a second, Descartes says. There could be some evil genius who exists out there, kind of like an evil god, who bends all of his efforts to deceive me. So while I think that 1 and 1 are 2, really it's 3. And so he entertains this kind of radical doubt. And so what is it that escapes this? And at last he comes up with this notion. It's the famous cogito ergo sum, right? I think. And while the content of my thought might be wrong, I think that there's a person sitting here, or I think there's a red cup placed on the table. While there might not be a person sitting here, while there might not be a cup on the table, the fact that I'm thinking cannot be doubted. And so I think. Therefore, I know necessarily that I as the thinker exist. But now what am I, this thinker? Am I a incarnate corporeal thinker? Well, no, I don't have justification in that belief yet. My body, how do I know my body exists? I see it, I feel it, perhaps even smell it. Hope not. But by means of my senses, I know the body exists. I doubt my senses, therefore I don't know that I have a body. Okay, so everything that Descartes is saying, I mean, you can, if you want to go down that route, perhaps the conspiracy theory route, you can go down that route. But now there's a problem. Because in ordinary life, I want to say that not only am I a thinker, but I'm also a physical thing here, right? And so how does he get this back? Well, he has to go through this huge rigmarole. I have to prove that God exists. But how do I prove that God exists? Only by thought. How then do I get outside of thought? He tries and tries again. But starting within thought, you're always going to be trapped within thought. And so we have then, following Descartes, this problem, the mind-body problem, right? The body is one thing. It's determined by its being extended. Thought is something else. It's not extended. It's completely immaterial. So how does your immaterial thought, mind, interact with your extended three-dimensional physical body? Descartes fudges and says, basically, it's these animal spirits located within the pineal gland that kind of, yeah. It's,
that would control the...
yeah, and he knows it's crap. I mean, he recognizes that this is a bad answer, but it's the only answer he can give. So here's the thing.
That's the only logical answer he could come to.
Is it even logical? That's the question. And so, I mean, here you have, after this, an entire history of philosophers who come about and say, okay, Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz says there's this pre-established harmony. God knows that at time X, you want to raise your hand. So God establishes the connection between your will and the fact that you raise your hand. Okay. Other, even more radical people, such as Nicolas Malebranche, say God is the only actor, right? You exercise no real causality. Only God does this. So when you're doing all of this business, that's all God doing it. Finally, you get to the Scottish Enlightenment with someone like David Hume, who recognizes this is all garbage. Why should I, if I begin with experience, why should I transcend experience? And God's obviously outside of experience, and so therefore I have no evidence that God exists. And so everything is just a matter of conjunction. There exists no causality, right? So here's the thing: when you're philosophizing, you're never going to be philosophizing in a vacuum from a neutral point of view. You're always philosophizing in a tradition, and consequently, it's the tradition which is going to set the questions for you. And so, in responding to that tradition, you're going to make a contribution, hopefully, but you also have to take responsibility for the answers that you give. Descartes has to take responsibility for the mind-body problem. Hume has to take responsibility for the fact that causality is undermined and the arising Newtonian mechanics has no footing whatsoever. So there's this notion of philosophizing within a tradition. When you look at theology, it's the exact same thing, right? Theology is always going to be grounded upon some kind of tradition, trying to understand some sort of experience. Likewise, then, there's going to have to be a kind of responsibility for the theologian to make certain that the contributions that he or she makes are going to be coherent with that tradition.
Okay. It's a lot to consume, but so I'll just pick off one.
Okay.
And that is well, I mean, first of all, do you believe that philosophy is maturing?
What do you mean by maturing?
Well, I mean, to your point, one philosopher learning from another, discarding another's potential views and so on and so forth. Not to suggest that they didn't have their own, right? Maturing in such a capacity that things that Aristotle and Socrates did not, or Plato did not. I mean, they're general. These are generalisms, right? But as you get to more modern day philosophers, they're much more tuned to specific events.
Yeah.
Say, for example, Kirk, you're a fan of Jordan Peterson, who is not a philosopher, but arguably is touting philosophy of a certain nature. Ayn Rand in the 50s was doing the same, much more leaning towards government and the way things are playing out, and so on and so forth. Maturing in that capacity, or do you think that there's independent enough thinkers in postmodernism in particular that are thinking in that capacity.
I think I'm hesitant to use the term maturing because when I hear of maturation,
I'm not sure if that's the right.
I think of linear continual progress.
Maybe I should call it independence.
I think what constitutes the history of philosophy, but not uniquely to philosophy, also science, and I think even perhaps you could say for theology as well, is that the history of philosophy, of science and theology is constituted by a variety of paradigm shifts, right? In which, look, you're operating from a certain, as I've been trying to suggest, right, tradition. Okay, you're operating from a certain paradigm, horizon, set of conceptual assumptions, trying to account for your experience. So to go back to our astronomical example, imagine if you live 2,500 years ago, what's going to be your, for lack of a better term, astronomical paradigm? Well, you're going to think the Earth is at the center of the solar system, the sun orbits that, the moon orbits that, the planets orbit that, the stars eventually orbit that. So you have a geocentric paradigm. But what happens? There's a certain kind of epistemic crisis that paradigm begins to suffer. If you look at the planets, they seem, of course, to be moving in a kind of circular pattern, but at a certain point they hit a retrograde planetary motion. Your paradigm can't account for that.
Well, I think it can happen that way in theology.
Absolutely.
Certainly.
Yes, which is why there are paradigm shifts even within theology.
Okay, so let's back up one more step. How does it happen, let's say, in this particular context, biblically, which is not intended for interpretation?
I think it is.
Well, many would suggest not.
I think they'd be wrong. I think everything's interpretation, right? And so
let's go down the path of Catholicism for just a moment, if you're permitted.
fine, yeah.
If you're permitted,
Sure.
Okay. And that would be that there is not much room there for suggestion or interpretation of particular.
I think there is.
If you go to a church, they'll suggest otherwise.
Well, let's look at the history of
I'm not
Catholicism.
talking that. I don't believe that.
Oh, yeah.
Or the theologians don't believe that, or the philosophers don't believe that. But Catholicism is Catholicism, no different. I'm not. It's not to suggest different Catholics don't think different things. Like you ask a priest one thing and on another, same question. To 10 different priests, you're going to get 4 different
absolutely.
answers. Right.
10 answers.
10 answers. You get 12 answers. Maybe 2 out of a couple.
They're
of them.
schizophrenic, yeah.
Right. So, but I don't think that. But I'm not talking. Maybe I should say it this way. That's because you're incorporating the human factor
Absolutely, yeah.
into interpretation. I don't believe that that's the way it was intended to be. It was intended to be. Here are the. Let's just break it down to something small. Here are the 10 Commandments. They're written very simply for your simpleton, if you will, to understand. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not, so on and so forth, right? It's not a complicated thing to understand. There is no interpretation in thou shalt not kill.
I think there is.
Do you? Tell me. Give me an example.
If you pull a gun on me, can I shoot you? Is that murder? I would say not.
Well, no, okay, so let's go back to your defense mechanism.
Okay.
Right, thou shalt not kill. So fair enough.
Okay.
I don't think it was intent. Okay, fair enough.
How about thou shalt not lie? If I'm in Amsterdam hiding 10 Jewish people in my attic during World War II, Nazi SS knocks on my door and asks me if I'm holding Jews, what do I do?
How does the church deal with that, in your opinion? Because I agree with you that there is room for these conditional circumstances in which lying is a good thing. For example, the Jewish folks being under a floor and lying about it, like Inglourious Bastards, which is a great movie, by the way.
Also, honey, that dress looks just fine on you. That
The
looks
answer is
great.
always yes.
That's a lie that's gonna
Tell
keep
Vicky.
you out of a lot of trouble. It's
you
gonna
look-
keep you out of hell.
You look beautiful today. Thou shalt not kill. Absolutely. Let's go with that one because it's probably one of the first and the harshest.
Sure.
Absolutely. Somebody comes into your home,
Wants to rape your
bearing a
wife
gun, wants to
and-
rape whatever it may be, and you kill. And I know I wouldn't feel bad about it.
Neither would I.
That's what you get. How do you think that the church either does or should deal with such definitive statements
Well, I think
that were made up,
because these
so long ago?
definitive statements are about life, which is not definitive and constituted by the nitty-gritty. right? And so I think they might seem simple, right? Thou shalt don't kill, don't lie, don't take God's name in vain. They seem simple, but they're lived out in life, which is extraordinarily complex. And I think that's where not just the church, but any philosopher is going to realize that certain distinctions are called in, are necessary. And so, yeah, if I just walk up to someone randomly, shoot that person, that's horrendously evil. That's murder.
But you already know that as a human being.
I don't know that I do.
Some people may not.
Well, if you're not, okay,
And to ask-
people love to challenge me on this one. Agreed. If you're mentally ill, you're not going to know that. If you're mentally ill, if you're under the guidance of alcohol, drugs, whatever. Okay, so circumstantially, a lot of people fall into that category. But if anybody of let's just call it normal sanity, and I don't want to get into what that really means,
Right.
but just a regular everyday person walks up and I shoot you outside for no reason other than, let's call it pure evil.
But now let's say I'm trying to,
I know I'm wrong.
but what if I'm trying to cleanse the world? I'm trying to cleanse the world of black hat wearing people.
Well,
And
then you get into serial killers.
So no. This is my
Right.
religion, right? And I have a whole group of followers who believe, yeah, if you wear a black hat,
No, I was going to say Marilyn Manson.
Yeah.
Or not
Thanos never
how
thought.
about-
he doesn't
I'm
think
sorry,
he's
not
doing
Marilyn,
it.
Charles Manson.
But how about this? What about the Incas? What about the Aztecs? I mean, they just found a grave of
Yeah, I saw that.
300 children who were sacrificed.
Yes, I saw that.
So, I mean, the point is there's interpretation.
Oh, you could talk about Hitler, right?
Yeah.
And not to be on
Is
a
he-
hot topic, when you're
right.
seeing look, he obviously, I don't want to say convinced, but so he wasn't the one piling hundreds and hundreds of
Thousands, millions, yeah.
Russians or Jewish bodies in the piles, and you see the people and so on and so forth. The people doing that were either convinced, forced, or otherwise to put themselves in those situations.
And
And,
so
and clearly it's wrong.
And so if you asked a Nazi soldier who just executed a Jewish child,
Right.
did you just murder that? No, I cleansed the world. I cleansed society of this vermin. That's not murder, right? So I concede that the Ten Commandments seem extraordinarily simple, right? But when lived out practically, there's questions of interpretation. Trying to discern
I'd
the
say
reality.
maybe I should retract if that's what I said. I said that they were written for simpleton
Sure.
purposes, because if you make them more complex, and I mean this respectfully to whoever, the majority of the population will not understand anything beyond four letters four words at a time.
Yeah.
So you make up something simple: thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, and so on and so forth, as a mechanism of, and this is where you could eventually get into it one day, as a mechanism of controlling people, right? To say, look, let's just come up with some basics here, all right? Don't kill people, don't lie, don't cheat, don't do this, don't steal, right?
It's a base of society.
Well,
Right, it's a base of society, but isn't it? And maybe we'll talk about this the next time you come on. Isn't it the originations of your first governments? Well, not first, because obviously the Romans were there much farther in advance, and so were the Aztecs. But a mechanism of suggesting, like, we've got to control the population in some capacity.
I can see how that can be a control mechanism. I personally don't think that it's the origin of culture and civilization. I think actually murder is the origin and control of civilization.
Explain that.
We all desire, right? And so we are a desiring kind of people. And so that desire, however, is not generated simply by myself, but is always going to be cultivated within a social context. So Kirk pulls up in a brand new white Ferrari, right? And I want that. Why? Because he has it.
Well, that's envy.
Well, of course it's envy, but it's created precisely by the social context. He has it. He's, and now everyone else has it. Now my next door neighbor has one. You have one.
But isn't that also built into the religion? The seven
Yes.
sins, if you will.
Yeah. But I mean,
envy, lust, so on and so forth.
well, I don't know. I don't think you can just simply say that a desire is necessarily envious.
Well, I'm using your example.
Right.
He has a white Ferrari. Somebody else has one. I want one too.
Sure.
It's envy.
Well, I don't know that it's envy because I see what the Joneses have, and I'm taught I should want that. I want a good job, right? I want a six-figure income. I want whatever. The point is this: we experience our lives in this tension socially, right, of desire. So, my kids just forced me to show them Karate Kid, right? And so here you have
The movie or
the movie,
show?
the
Oh,
show.
the
No, the 1984 one.
The original.
Right, the original one.
Okay.
And so here you have Mr. Miyagi
Yeah.
and Daniel-san, right?
I love Mr. American. By the way, he's dead too.
I know. And so here's Mr. Miyagi. And Daniel-san looks up to him, right? This guy can teach me karate so I can defend against the bullies.
Right.
And so what happens? Mr. Miyagi's the model. Daniel-san wants what the model has, right? So it goes through the whole training process, wax on, wax off. Exactly.
wax off.
Right. But there comes a point that Daniel-san begins to not only learn from Mr. Miyagi. Now, this is not contained within the movie, but this is an example of what happens in our social relationships.
It's implied.
Right. There's a point where Daniel-san can then rival Mr. Miyagi.
Mhm.
So the two then become competitors. And so this in itself generates a kind of violence. So there's this one theorist, René Girard, who speaks of mimesis, mimetic violence. And so socially then, when we're taught by our society and social peers to desire things, then we begin entering into this kind of violent competition for the same exact object, right? So, think about this. If you go to, you have kids. If you go to a playground and there's a toy in the middle of the sandbox, no one's playing with it. But as soon as one child goes over and starts playing with that toy, what happens? Susie wants it. Oh, Billy wants it. Oh, Jimmy wants it. And what happens?
Lord of the Flies.
Exactly. They start fighting. So there's this escalating mimetic contagion. Something has to alleviate that. And the thought is, and you see this within mythologies, within ancient cultures, there's a scapegoat. There's a single victim who's identified. And the entire wrath of the community is going to be placed upon the shoulders of the scapegoat and eliminated, killed, right? And what that does then is you see that the violent tensions within society are controlled and they are mitigated. But then this person who's a scapegoat, right? That person's the reason why society is feeling all of this violent tendency. Now that the scapegoat has been eliminated and there's a return to peace, that scapegoat is seen as the reason for the peace and thus divinized and becomes a god, right? So there has to be then a kind of
sounds
culture.
like a sacrifice. in a way.
Absolutely, right?
I mean, the scapegoat is
Right,
sacrificed in order for the greater good of nonviolence.
Right, and so then that's the origin and the beginning of culture, is the original sacrifice. And so you have a kind of scapegoat mechanism put in place, a ritual sacrifice, whereby the mimetic tension that emerges from within our social fabric can be managed and controlled.
So how does that manifest itself in modern day culture in the Western Hemisphere, if you will?
Turn on the news and you see scapegoats.
Well, I mean, you see,
Right.
it's true, but not nearly in a.
Hitler, right? To go back to Hitler.
Well, no. I think that's kind of what I'm leading
Yeah.
to. Not to suggest at all that that's a path to go down. No, what I'm suggesting is that we see it on the news every
Yeah.
day, but it's very unequal,
Absolutely.
right? So, is there a pent up demand?
I think there's always a pent-up demand. There's always a kind of...
I mean, I want to say it kind of a bit contentiously.
Mm-hmm.
Is there pent up demand for murder, if you will, built within human beings?
I think if you understand murder in the broad sense, not just the actual taking of life, but in the sense of persecuting someone, yes, right? Because it's what we want. I mean, so imagine if you grow up in a poor environment, a poor society, a poor neighborhood, right? And you see one of your peers who's beginning to get an education, become successful, he's going to get out. How do you want to crush him, right? look, everyone's suffering here. Everyone's suffering in poverty. Everyone's suffering in violence. Everyone's suffering in lack of opportunity. But here's this one person who seems like he's going to get out. And for no other reason, you want to do what? Crush him, right? I mean, you look at this, and broadly speaking, you have wealthy people. And what do poor people want? Well, they have to pay something, right? I want them to suffer. It's great when I see them fall. And so I think there is this kind of desire within society to see someone suffer, because that does what? That alleviates my sense of suffering.
So let's put it a different way. There's not necessarily a pent-up, and I wasn't to suggest that there's a pent-up demand for people to go murdering people.
No,
I think what I'm saying is, metaphorically speaking, that it's manifesting itself in a different capacity.
Yeah, violence in the
right,
broad sense.
through violence, through a variety of things, wouldn't it be? I mean, through violence, through bullying, through whatever.
Yeah, the full spectrum of violence.
The full spectrum of that, whatever violence to violence is, right? So, and that's unfortunate. But again, I'll get back to, I think it's built in that we are this way.
Well, I think it's been going on since Thag hit Grok with the club because he had fire, and ever since then, there's been wanting what somebody else wants, whether or not it's envy or whatever it is. So if you insert the commandments, let's just say the commandments were a sense of control, because humans by nature aren't rational necessarily. I mean, maybe I'm going out on a limb there, but that's why those constructs were put into place, was to alleviate that chaos that's driven.
Well, I mean, look at to go back to the biblical imagery, right? Cain and Abel. And what happens? Cain is envious of Abel and does what?
Oh, I mean, it starts at the beginning.
It starts at the beginning.
Biblically
right.
it does, right? So it takes him out.
And I think that's the foundation of the Canaanite culture, right? Which is a kind of image that the Scripture, the Bible recognizes, that violence operates at the very heart of the foundation of cultures.
That'll bring us to a whole new conversation next time. If you could again, reintroduce yourself.
I'm Victor Solis, and I study philosophy.
We certainly appreciate having on
Thank you.
today, and it was a very interesting conversation. To all those who were equally as fascinated, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.